You are Gerald, right? The one who used to run training. That was what the new hire asked me as I was digging printer toner out of a cardboard box at 8:15 on a Tuesday morning. Not Director Gerald. Not even Mr. Miller. Just the guy who used to run training, as if I were some faded department store. Santa nobody warned him to expect. I smiled. I still smile depending on who you ask. The young man chuckled awkwardly, thinking he had made a joke. I did not laugh. 15 years. That was how long I had been building the spine of Aegis Consulting. I designed the hiring protocols, the onboarding systems, the training ladders. Hell, I wrote the entire employee handbook before human resources even knew what an organizational chart was. And now I was squatting next to a dusty supply cabinet, getting mistaken for the help. Welcome to corporate development, also known as the department no one remembers until morale craters or a major lawsuit shows up. Do not get me wrong, I never needed applause. I watched executives I personally trained promote each other over expensive drinks at fake authentic whiskey bars while I received grocery store cupcakes in the break room. That is a specific flavor of humility. Yet I stayed because deep down, I believed in what I had built. I believed in the idea that training was not just overhead but a legacy. It turns out that legacy does not fit neatly on a balance sheet, but layoffs make great bar graphs. The joke started in year 7. Gerald is a lifer, king of the onboarding jungle. Do not mess with him, he probably has dirt on everyone. I smiled through them all. I let them think I was the harmless office uncle who brought donuts and laminated sign-in sheets. I let them forget I had access to every executive's Myers-Briggs results and resignation timelines. I let them overlook the equity clause I had negotiated back in the dinosaur days, when our founding chief executive officer still used a Hotmail account and begged us to take equity instead of cash bonuses. Most of the other vice presidents laughed and flipped theirs back to the company for quick cash. I kept mine. Quietly, carefully. By year 11, they stopped joking and just forgot I was even in the room. Meetings went from let us loop in Gerald to who owns training again, like I was a ghost haunting the shared calendar. I watched 7 bosses cycle through above me. All of them were some flavor of young and hungry. All of them were obsessed with key performance indicators, click-through rates, and culture upgrades. All of them were temporary. I outlasted them like mold on a communal coffee mug. In year 13, I stopped waiting to be seen. I started investing in myself the way the company never would. I spent my weekends on video calls with governance consultants. I hired a career strategist out of my own pocket. I paid for an executive leadership program with a name so pretentious I had to lie to my sister Clara Miller and say I was going on a yoga retreat. The board thought I was trying to find myself, and they were not entirely wrong. The real find was a clause buried in my original agreement. It was a right of first refusal on any voting structure changes, signed back when we had fewer than 70 employees. It was a clause the current board forgot existed, but one I had been quietly reinforcing through documented approvals, internal alliances, and training programs that just happened to include legal and fiduciary accountability. We called it corporate development. If you are 9 minutes into this and still listening, first off, bless your overworked soul. Second, if you are one of the 95% who listens but forgets to hit that little subscribe button, do us all a favor and click it. Same with the thumbs up. It actually helps keep stories like this coming from the team. And if you do not, well, maybe Julian is your boss too, and maybe you need to hear what is coming next. By year 15, I was the institutional wallpaper. The person you blame when the internal messaging system stops syncing or a training video has a minor typo. The man who just knows things. I said nothing when they brought in the new chief financial officer with a startup ego and a yacht on his social media. I said even less when he snuck a strategic advisory fee into our diversity training budget. But I logged every invoice, every receipt, and every training hour mocked in leadership huddles. I smiled because the thing about people like me is that we do not scream when the fire starts. We just pull the fireproof files from the drawer, check the bylaws, and start rewriting the ending. The new chief executive officer, Lawrence Vance, arrived in a hurricane of professional quotes and cologne that smelled like regret and eucalyptus. The board practically kneeled before him before he even walked through the door. Disruptive leadership, they called it. Fresh energy. In reality, it meant he was younger, louder, and completely untethered from the soul of the company he was supposed to run. His handshake was firm, his smile surgically white, and he introduced himself by saying, "We were not here to maintain. We were here to dominate." Then came Julian Pierce. Julian strutted in 4 days later, a full 35 years old with a Harvard business degree and all the emotional intelligence of a cheese grater. He wore skinny suits and looked like he had photoshopped himself into his own business cards. His title was Chief of Strategy Implementation. His mission was to slash, burn, and optimize. His favorite phrase was legacy overhead. I became fluent in Julian within a single week. And Julian Pierce held a cultural reorganization meeting where he replaced all department names with sleek acronyms. People development became human potential excellence, or some equivalent nonsense. My team, my actual humans, looked at me like scared passengers on the Titanic. I did not have the heart to tell them we had already struck the iceberg. When a guy like Julian starts asking how much redundancy is built into a department, what he really means is how fast he can gut your team without needing to refill the empty chairs. 3 weeks later, my calendar went from standing meetings with department heads to quick syncs with interns. My budget requests went completely unanswered. My system permissions were downgraded without explanation. Then came the email from Julian's assistant titled Updated Role Scope, Urgent Signature Needed. The attached document was 3 pages of legally dressed up marketing perfume. Somewhere in the middle was the bombshell. My authority over training, onboarding, and internal policy development would be transferred to strategic operations for streamlined oversight. In other words, I was being turned into a corporate mascot, a smiling figurehead for a program they had already hollowed out. I read the document twice, laughed once, then forwarded it to a lawyer I knew on retainer, Valerie Vance. She responded with one line telling me not to sign it yet. Behind closed doors, Julian turned colder by the day. In meetings, he would interrupt me mid-sentence, telling me to keep things future-facing. If I mentioned past outcomes, he would tell me we were not running a museum. During a quarterly review, he leaned across the table and told me that while I was brilliant at creating systems, systems get stale and they needed lean energy now. I smiled and sipped my tea. It is a good thing I know how to compost dead weight. He did not laugh. He never got my jokes. The team I had mentored for years was scattered overnight. One was transferred to a product role for cross-functional development. Another was invited to take a lateral move into supply chain management. One was just gone, like he had evaporated in the break room. I was not even told until I saw his coffee mug still sitting in the dishwasher a week later. The final straw came when they moved my desk. Not just figuratively, but literally. My corner office with the glass walls, the one with the fake fern I had kept alive for 14 years, was reassigned to a new consultant named Brenda Thorne, who specialized in return on investment accountability. I was given a workstation near the communal printer. No door, no fake fern, just toner fumes and a view of the hallway where Julian marched past daily like a hall monitor in a corporate drama. He stopped once, leaned on my desk, and expressed his hope that I was not too attached to titles since we were all fluid now. I looked up and told him I had never needed a title to do damage. He grinned like I was flirting. That was when the confusion vanished and the hurt hardened into a deliberate plan. I had seen boys like this before. They think office politics is a game of chess, but they play like toddlers, flipping the board when they begin to lose. What they do not realize is that I built this board. I know which tiles are glued down and which ones trigger the trap door. I did not raise my voice and I did not cry in the parking lot. I simply called my lawyer, Valerie, and started reading the company bylaws again, line by line, highlighting anything that looked outdated. It turned out the foundation Julian wanted to bulldoze had roots, and those roots had teeth. I first noticed the financial repackaging when a monthly summary landed in my inbox and read like it had been run through a corporate blender. Line items that used to say leadership coaching or compliance training were now condensed under vague buckets like operational support flow and intangible resources non-client facing. It was a financial word soup, and Julian was the one stirring the ladle. My name was still all over the original approval chains. Every line now labeled non-essential had once passed through my hands. Now those expenses were being turned into ammunition. A week later, I received a polite email from the audit and risk team asking for clarification on several entries dating back 4 fiscal years. They wanted details on why I approved a series of one-on-one coaching sessions with a leadership consultant and whether it was justified in terms of return on investment. I did not answer right away. Instead, I started printing receipts, approval chains, meeting notes, and slide decks with Julian's name, stamped on projects that used frameworks I had designed 3 years earlier. I organized them all. The cherry on top was a quarterly budget deck I found buried in our shared drive, stripped of my metadata, but featuring my original formatting and talking points, word for word. Julian had never met a mirror he did not love. That weekend, I drove out to the lake house I co-owned with my sister Clara Miller. With no wireless connection, just 3 legal pads and 4 bottles of dark red wine, I made a list of every budget Julian had touched since his arrival. I cross-referenced them against legacy expenditures and highlighted every deviation. The pattern was clear. He was quietly erasing institutional memory, mine especially, replacing it with buzzwords and spreadsheets that no one would question until something broke. The doubts crept in when I reached out to Human Resources. I asked if they could confirm my current title in the organization chart. The woman on the line got oddly quiet before saying she would check and get back to you. That was when I knew the machinery was moving. I called my lawyer Valerie, and she told me to keep every version of every email. The next morning, I walked in and noticed my nameplate had been replaced. It did not say director anymore. It said advisor of talent continuity. I had not been told. I laughed out loud, loud enough that the new intern dropped his yogurt. I slid the plate into my bag. That afternoon, I got the whisper. I was in the stairwell heading to the roof for a phone call when someone called my name. It was Sarah Jenkins, a junior manager on the marketing team. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around. She handed me her phone showing a live Slack thread from a private strategy channel. The message read that they should finalize the package and schedule the termination before the first quarter kickoff, preferably on Friday to avoid legacy noise dragging into planning. The message above it asked how to shut off access post-meeting to prevent Gerald Miller from catching wind early. I handed the phone back slowly. Sarah nodded and walked away. I stood in the stairwell for a long time, realizing they were preparing to erase me. They called me in at 9 o'clock sharp on Friday morning. The invite was titled Strategic Realignment Touchpoint, which was corporate speak for an execution. I did not bring my laptop or a notebook, just a fountain pen with black ink and a sharp nib. Julian Pierce sat at the head of the glass conference room. He wore a blue suit with no socks, his ankles exposed. Human Resources sat beside him, represented by a senior coordinator named Madeline, who looked extremely uncomfortable. A printed termination packet lay on the table with my name in bold letters. Julian motioned to the seat across from him. I remained standing. He sighed dramatically and told me they had concluded my role no longer aligned with their strategic direction, and my position was being eliminated effective immediately. Human Resources slid the packet across the table. Julian added that this was no reflection on my past contributions, but there were questions about some expenditures, calling them vanity certifications and personal consulting sessions. He called it misuse of company funds, saying the company was being generous with their severance package. I did not react. I uncapped my pen and signed the bottom of the first page. I slid the packet back, pulled out my security badge, and placed it gently on the table. I looked Julian in the eye and told him I looked forward to formally introducing myself at the board meeting on Monday. The air changed instantly. Julian blinked, demanding to know which board meeting I meant. I just smiled, turned, and walked out without another word. Outside the glass doors stood 2 security officers. One was Bruce Stone, who had been on the night shift for 7 years before I helped him get promoted. He nodded and held the door open, whispering that this was not right and I deserved better. I paused, looked him in the eye and said I would settle for justice. He smirked. I walked straight out of the building. No boxes of personal items, no tears. The cold autumn air bit through my coat, and I inhaled deeply, feeling the chill of overdue retribution humming beneath my ribs. I went straight to a cafe across town to meet the board chair, George Caldwell. We sat in a corner booth, the windows fogged up by the rain. I ordered a hot cup of black coffee and opened my folio, spreading out the corporate documents. George looked at the papers, his expression hardening. We spent the next 3 hours mapping out the agenda for Monday morning, aligning our strategies and ensuring every legal base was covered. There was no room for error. Julian and Lawrence Vance thought they had won, but they had merely walked into the trap we had spent months preparing. As the cafe lights flickered, I knew that the weekend would be long, but the victory would be absolute. In that quiet cafe booth, George Caldwell and I reviewed the company bylaws line by line, preparing for Monday morning. I opened my folio, which contained a signed notarized voting proxy, a shareholder motion drafted by Valerie Vance, and a schedule for the board meeting. I texted George that we were all set, and he replied within 60 seconds, telling me he would see me on Monday. By the time I got home on Friday night, the shock had worn off. I walked straight to my home office, unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk with the key hidden in my wallet, and opened it. Inside were the folders I had compiled. The first was labeled Voting Rights Legacy Clause. It was the original agreement from 14 years ago, signed by the founding chief executive officer and original board members. That clause granted me the right to amend and co-sign governance policies in lieu of cash bonuses. The current executive team had completely forgotten it existed. I had spent 15 years accumulating voting rights and building relationships, and now those quiet investments were about to pay off in the most spectacular fashion. I remembered the early days of Aegis Consulting, when there were only 5 of us working out of a small, cramped brick building on the edge of the city. We would stay up past midnight eating cold pizza and arguing about corporate strategy, building this firm from the ground up. The founder had pleaded with me to accept equity because the company could not afford cash bonuses back then. I had agreed, demanding that the clause be notarized and permanently written into our core corporate bylaws. Now that piece of paper was the key to reclaiming everything I had built. The second folder contained shareholder holdings confirmations. My personal stake was 42.5%. Combined with 2 trusted allies on the advisory board whom I had mentored over the years, we controlled 65% of the voting shares. We had the majority, silent and legally binding. The board members I mentored knew the history of Aegis Consulting, and they knew that the current leadership was running the company into the ground with short-term metrics. The third folder contained the documentation of Julian's expenditures. This was my primary legal weapon. I had documented how Julian Pierce had committed a clear breach of fiduciary duty under corporate law. Specifically, he had violated the duty of loyalty and duty of care by self-dealing. He had approved a contract worth $38,000 to a shell company named Perform Group LLC, which was registered under his college roommate, Harvey Crenshaw. Julian had bypassed the standard vendor compliance review and authorized an expedited wire transfer without disclosing the conflict of interest to the board. Under corporate law, the duty of loyalty requires directors and officers to act in good faith and in the best interests of the corporation. When Julian directed company funds to his roommate's shell company without disclosure or independent approval, he breached this fundamental duty. This was not just a violation of internal guidelines. It was a clear violation of state corporation law. Under the legal doctrine of breach of fiduciary duty, an officer who engages in self-dealing and exposes the corporation to legal liability can be removed for cause immediately, and any contracts signed under such conflict of interest are void ab initio. Furthermore, I had printed the performance report Julian's friend had delivered. It was plagiarized verbatim from a 2021 McKinsey white paper. This plagiarism constituted copyright infringement, exposing Aegis Consulting to significant federal liability. I had spent hours on my dual monitors comparing the 2 documents, finding matches for phrases like streamlining resource optimization paradigms to unlock client-facing velocity. The entire report was a lazy copy-and-paste job. I had the state registry filings, the domain records, and the highlighted comparisons of the plagiarized text. It was a complete dossier of misconduct. The 4th folder contained the bylaw revisions. George Caldwell and I had drafted them 12 months ago under the guise of operational redundancy mitigation. We redefined quorum voting procedures and shifted executive oversight power to any shareholder majority coalition. Under Section 15D of the bylaws and Clause 18C of the Legacy Charter, I had the right to call an immediate vote of no confidence. On Sunday evening, George texted me that the majority coalition was aligned and legal counsel was prepared. I laid out my dark tailored suit. I had spent 15 years being the foundation of Aegis Consulting. On Monday, I would walk through those doors not as a terminated employee, but as a co-owner bringing structure and corporate fire. I spent the last few hours of Sunday night staring out at the calm waters of the lake, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. The peace was comforting, but the fire inside me was burning hotter than ever. I was ready. Monday morning arrived, and the boardroom was filled with the smell of warm blueberry muffins. The board was seated by 9:55. The chief financial officer, Richard Barlow, chatted with the chair, while Brenda Thorne adjusted her blazer. Julian Pierce stood by the projector full of confidence. He began his presentation, bragging that department overhead was down 55%, omitting my name entirely. He spoke of growth metrics, cost reductions, and operational efficiencies, painting a beautiful picture of a streamlined future that did not exist. Before he could continue, George Caldwell interrupted him, stating we had a procedural matter to address first. Julian blinked in confusion. The side door opened and I walked in, carrying my black folio. Julian turned, telling me this was unexpected. I stepped to the table, laid my folio down, and wished everyone a good morning. George cleared his throat, citing Section 15D of the bylaws, which allowed any equity partner holding a qualifying voting block to present a motion at the opening of the session. I announced that as a recognized equity partner, I was exercising my right to call for an immediate review of departmental restructuring outcomes, budget relocations, and executive consulting approvals. General Counsel Eleanor Caldwell confirmed the motion was within our legal rights. Julian forced a chuckle, saying we did not need to rehash ancient spending. George folded his hands and replied that efficiency without compliance is a liability. I opened my folio and handed out the documents. The board members leaned forward, the rustle of paper filling the silent room. I presented the original signatures from CFO Richard Barlow and Chairwoman Evelyn Haskins, showing my trainings were board approved. Then I pivoted to Julian's expenditures, specifically the $38,000 paid to Perform Group LLC. I turned to Eleanor, who confirmed the company had no compliance record for the vendor. I presented the business registry listing, showing the firm belonged to Harvey Crenshaw, Julian's roommate, and proved the domain was created 4 days before the first invoice. Finally, I showed the plagiarized McKinsey report with the copied sentences highlighted in yellow. No one moved. Julian stared at the table, his face turning the color of raw shrimp. Eleanor Caldwell put on her glasses and began reading the highlighted sections of the report. She looked up at Julian, her face a mask of disappointment. She noted that copyright infringement was a serious federal offense, and by utilizing a plagiarized document to justify a major restructuring, Julian had exposed Aegis Consulting to significant liability. She declared that under our current bylaws, this constituted gross negligence and a clear breach of fiduciary duty, giving the board full authority to terminate him for cause immediately without any severance. The other board members murmured in agreement, their faces grim. I looked at Julian and said that while he thought I was wasting money on training, I was actually preparing for his job. George Caldwell laughed out loud, looked at his watch, and called for the vote. The chair read the motion of no confidence against Julian Pierce for unauthorized financial disbursements, vendor misrepresentation, and breach of fiduciary duty. One by one, the hands rose, the CFO, the board members, and the chair. Eleanor Caldwell confirmed the motion carried. Julian stood frozen, his eyes darting from one board member to another. He tried to speak, claiming that the report was just a draft, that he was going to credit the source, and that training programs were still a waste of resources. He accused me of orchestrating a personal vendetta to protect my outdated department. But his words fell flat. George Caldwell merely shook his head and waved his hand, signaling to Bruce Stone. Julian stood up, stammering that this could not be binding. George told him he was no longer the chief executive officer and could address his concerns through counsel. Julian looked at the board, then at me. I held his eye contact. He walked out of the room, leaving his folders behind. Brenda Thorne immediately gathered her things and slipped out of the room. Realizing her connection to Julian made her position untenable. George Caldwell turned to the board, noting they were obligated to appoint an interim chief executive officer within 72 hours. Eleanor suggested someone with deep internal knowledge and compliance experience. The CFO agreed. George turned to me, asking if I would serve as the interim chief executive officer. I stood before them, feeling the weight of the last 15 years of hard work. I had started at this company when it was just an idea in a small brick building, and now I was taking the helm to save it from the damage Julian had caused. I looked at the board members, nodded slowly, and accepted the responsibility. I've promised them that we would restore the company's core values, focus on real employee development, and clean up the compliance mess. The CFO smiled and shook my hand, followed by the rest of the board. I officially accepted the position. Julian burst back into the room a moment later, pointing at me and yelling that this was a mistake and that I was emotional. I stood up, gathered my documents, and told him security was waiting. Bruce Stone stood at the door, arms crossed. Julian muttered something and walked out for the last time, his legacy in ruins. I walked down the hallway, entered my new office, and sat down at the desk. I opened the bottom drawer, pulled out the red folder labeled Succession Plan, Phase 2, and opened it. This was never about revenge. It was about restoration.